Hi everyone, thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Will and I work in the school attendance policy team here in the department. This afternoon's session is about consistent coding in the register and effective day-to-day attendance processes. I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by Lisa, Ian and Asya from Star Academies, who will be talking about their approach to these things in their trust. Lisa is the Director of Education at the Trust and will be introducing the Trust and the context. Ian will then be talking to us about the overall approach that the Trust takes and ensuring consistency across all of the schools within the Trust. And then Asya will cover a specific example of what they do at Eden Boys School. As usual, we'll also have a short section at the end for Q&A, so please submit any questions in the sidebar as we go along. And as lots of people will already know, we've run a number of these sessions already, so you should be able to find links to all the recordings also in the sidebar. So if you're interested in those, please have a look and check those out. We'll be, as usual, sharing the slides with everyone after this session, so anyone who's signed up will receive an email afterwards with a PDF copy of all of the slides. Next Thursday, we've got Sapienta Education Trust, who will be also talking to us about how they work with families, the local authority and other partners effectively to support stronger attendance. And that, I think, is everything by way of introduction from me. If we can just move on to the next slide, I'll set out briefly what the new attendance guidance says about completing admission and attendance registers and effective day-to-day processes. So as you can see, this is one of the 7 kind of core expectations that are set out in the new school attendance guidance, and the guidance will apply from September 2022, so this September. If I can have the next slide as well, please. So the expectations and legal responsibilities around recording attendance are effectively unchanged from previous iterations of the guidance, but as a reminder, and you can see it on the screen here, all schools, obviously including independent schools, have to have an admissions register that they use to record pupils and an attendance register. All pupils obviously have to be placed on the admission register and have their attendance recorded in the register, and there are obviously 2 sessions where attendance needs to be recorded. There's a session in the morning where the register is taken, and then a session in the afternoon. Schools obviously have to record at those points in line with the regulations whether a pupil is present, attending an approved educational activity, absent, or unable to attend for exceptional circumstances. And then there are a number of, as you'll know from joining the call, a number of attendance codes that map onto those specific categories of absence and presence. And as it says here at the bottom in the regulations, obviously a school that fails to comply with the regulations around recording in the register is guilty of an offence and can be fined. If we can have the next slide as well, please. So yeah, the register is obviously an important legal record, so schools have to preserve every entry in the attendance or admissions register for 3 years from the date of entry, and the register should only be routinely amended where the reason for absence cannot be established at the time that it's taken. So it shouldn't be very frequently updated and modified, the kind of entries in that register. Right. I'll just move us on now briefly to the day-to-day processes and expectations of schools with regards to that in the new guidance. You can see here we expect schools to proactively manage lateness and set out register closing times in their policy. We want parents to let schools know about unexplained absences, and we expect schools to put in place first day calling where that doesn't happen, so to follow up regularly and in a timely fashion with parents where pupils don't attend. We obviously expect schools to regularly inform parents about pupil attendance, so how regularly the child is attending school, so that parents can support their children to attend more regularly. And obviously we expect schools to hold regular meetings with parents of pupils who are considered to be vulnerable or who may be at risk of absence or persistent absence, so that they can discuss attendance, they can discuss what steps can be taken, and they can put plans in place to ensure that the child is able to regularly attend school. An important penultimate bullet here, which is about ensuring that schools regularly share the kind of relevant attendance data with their local authority to allow them to effectively discharge their statutory obligations as well. So that's an important one. And then the final bullet about supporting pupils back into school following lengthy or unavoidable periods of absence, and the kind of importance there of providing some scaffolding and support to ensure that that child is able to reintegrate back into school and able to regularly attend. So that's a kind of brief overview of the guidance and our expectations in the guidance and how that gets recorded in the register. I'm sure everyone has joined to hear about exactly what Star Academies do in this regard. So I'll hand over in the first instance to Lisa, who's going to introduce the work of the Trust. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, Will. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you this afternoon, and we're very much looking forward to this session and sharing just some of our ideas and strategies and processes that we use at Star. I'm Lisa, I'm the Director of Education at Star, and I'm joined today by Ian, who is our Attendance Improvement Lead, and we also have Asia, who is an Executive Principal in our Midlands Star Partnership. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the objectives of today's session is really to give you an understanding of what we're about. Everything links to our Star vision and our key priorities. We also want to help others understand what multi-academies can do to ensure accurate and consistent coding practice. We also want to share with you some of the attendance management strategies that happen on the ground in schools to improve and maintain excellent attendance. Okay, so nurturing today's young people and inspiring tomorrow's leaders, that's our vision at Star. And everything we do falls back on our vision. We have three key priorities at the Trust. Our first is keeping our pupils safe, happy and well, achieving and sustaining academic excellence, and thirdly, building a strong Star community. And we understand that attendance underpins every aspect of our vision, but also those three key priorities. Ultimately, if we don't have pupils in school, then they are at risk of not being safe, happy and well. They're at risk of not achieving and sustaining academic excellence, and also they're not part of a strong Star community. Pre-COVID, Star were very pleased and proud to say that we had 3 schools in the top 10 nationally for attendance, including the highest performing. Coming out of the pandemic, which we know has had many challenges for all, we've continued to achieve levels of attendance well above the national samples on site attendance data, even when it's been adjusted for the X-code and without. Our most successful school in 2021-2022 is Eden Boys School, Birmingham, currently with an end of year cumulative attendance of 98%. And Asia will tell you a little bit more about the recipe for success at that school. We have 31 schools in our trust, a mixture of primary and secondary, covering 5 regions. We call them Star Partnerships in London, in the Midlands, in Lancashire, in Manchester, and also in Yorkshire. And our current attendance, including all schools, sits at around 94%, which is above the national average. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ian, who's going to tell you about the general principles of our Attend Like a Star strategy. Over to you, Ian.
You're on mute currently, Ian.
Hi everyone, sorry that it's a rookie mistake at this point in the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, that isn't it? But it's an absolute pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I just want to start by underlining some of the Attend Like the Star principles that we have. So for example, we make every effort not to leave any child behind. We totally understand that there's some huge barriers to attendance at the moment. But we are very persistent. We will ring every day, even though we probably know in those most difficult cases what answer we're going to get. We will continue to explore which agencies might be able to help. We just won't give in, and eventually we hope for a breakthrough, and working with our partners that is often achieved. We believe in absolutely regularly revisited rigorous routines. Not easy to say on a Wednesday afternoon or a Thursday afternoon at the end of a working day. But we also know that those routines won't work for every pupil. So we've also got to have some bespoke and creative solution focused interventions that are all about that specific case. Our actions are absolutely driven by the data, but we never forget that behind that is a real person, a real child and a real parent. And for some of these children and parents, it can be an extremely stressful time. And we bring to bear some expert knowledge on what are complex barriers to attendance in some of our schools. We recognise that attendance is usually a symptom, and actually somewhere there is a deeper cause, and that may be to do with behaviour or safeguarding or SEND, and therefore we have other improvement leads like myself working in those areas that can also bring their expertise to the party in terms of really working through these cases and how we can break down those barriers to attendance. Next slide, please. We'll start off today by having a look at coding and how we can achieve that accurate and consistent coding across our schools. It's something that we put a tremendous amount of effort in. But I want to start off by sort of highlighting why we think it's important. First of all, it's a huge element of safeguarding. So as particularly in secondary schools, we track the pupils all the way through the day using our registers. Obviously in primary schools, we've just been recording those 2 main statutory sessions, but we very carefully monitor lesson to lesson attendance in our secondaries. Where pupils aren't where they should be, it's really important to close that down really quickly. You know, to get sort of feet on the ground, to put out the feelers and find out where that pupil is, and if we have any concerns, obviously to let any parents know, etc. They're usually somewhere with a member of staff, but it's really important that we do that process anyway. Obviously, the data is really important. I've already mentioned that our data has a really important part to play in our action planning. So, for example, if our data is telling us in a school that unauthorised holidays are particularly high, then we need to do something around the communications with parents about that particular issue. However, if the input isn't correct, then the data that we're going to get out isn't going to be telling us the right things. So it's really important from that perspective that we get the absolute accuracy and consistency of that coding practice. As was mentioned earlier by Will, obviously the DfE guidance is really important, and we want to align ourselves fully with that. And we're also very cognizant that it is a legal document, a register, and it may well go to court. And any mistakes that are identified at court could end, for example, a legal process. That case could not be pursued any further by a magistrate simply because the register isn't accurately recorded. So again, another key reason. More importantly, in a sense, it sort of also could penalise pupils and their parents and disadvantage the school themselves if we don't get that coding correct. A very small but good example, I think, is the use of the J code. And when I do sort of external reviews or we take on a new sponsored academy, it's a code that is rarely used by schools, and that code is used when a pupil is going on an interview with another educational establishment. So, for example, a family might be considering moving area and looking at schools and deciding whether that school is right for their child. So many schools would code that as a C for other authorised circumstances, but it should be a J, and a J is a present mark. It writes back to a present mark, and a C would be an absence. So it would be unfair to penalise the child or the parents in that way. Of course, well-maintained registers, especially the comments that go alongside the codes, also are key to communication. And the more information we have, the more intelligence that we can gather, the easier it is to support and challenge our families. So just to sort of, and I hope that's not shouty writing at the bottom, I suppose it is shouty writing, but the end goal absolutely isn't just to get a fantastic statistic. The end goal is for our pupils to fulfil their potential, whether that's academic potential or it's their personal development. And when we need to mark absences, they should be marked as absences, because we need to know that that pupil isn't there, so that we can then take the right action to improve their attendance over time. OK, next slide, please. So very briefly, I'm going to go into some of these things in a little bit more detail in a second, but very briefly, in order to achieve this goal of consistent and accurate coding, then first of all, we add on and we build on to the DFE national expectations with our own STAR expectations. We're an organisation that always sets ourselves very high goals and has very high expectations of our colleagues, and therefore we have further guidance really about what we would expect to see in registers. We are all over the data, and it's really, really important to do that, so that we are constantly on a daily basis looking at our data. And when the data doesn't look right, for example, there's a big increase in attendance, or there's a decrease in attendance, or there's something not quite right in our data analysis, it leads us to a deep dive to work out why. And it might be that something's changed, like there's been a sickness bug, for example, in a school, or it might be that actually there's been a mistake in the coding, missing marks, for example, which would affect the overall outcome of the data. Or somebody, a member of staff has been absent, somebody's filled in and not got that coding quite correct. So it's that daily analysis that leads us to the deep dive to ensure that we've got coding consistency and accuracy. We also intervene when standards fall short. For example, the example I've just given is sometimes when staff move on, and they move on with a lot of experience and knowledge of families, and therefore we need to offer the support and challenge for those schools to ensure that we can maintain those standards. And we also categorise our schools so that they are organised into the schools that need the most support will get the most time from our central team. Those schools that have excellent attendance, a school like Asia's, for example, and have excellent coding practice, they don't need a lot of our time. We need to be focused on the schools where can we make the biggest difference. That said, every school does have compliance checks, so we can be confident that the coding is always accurate. Next slide, please. So this is our additional guidance, our attendance coding register management standard operating procedure. I'll just give 3 examples where we do something additional to the what was the old guidance. The first one's now been adopted in the new guidance from September, which is we've always had a 1-week deadline for the processing of NCODES, unexplained absence. That's now a 5 working day process in the new guidance from September. So it's totally aligned with what our expectations were, and I think that's the right move and the right decision. We always ask for specific reasons for absence. Sometimes when I do external reviews or we take on a new school, we have a lot of comments that things like they've been sick or unwell, but we know that because they're I-coded. We know they're sick, they know they're unwell. We want to know exactly why are they sick. You know, what's the specific reason that parents are telling us? And if we don't get a specific reason, for example, in a telephone message, we'll ring back to find out much more specifically. And this was absolutely key during the phase of COVID, when we were looking out for those key symptoms of a persistent cough and a temperature and anosmia. It really helped to drill down into the exact reasons why our children were off. So we don't, for example, we don't accept things like they've got a cold or they've got flu. We'll say, well, what does that look like? What are the symptoms? We also ask anybody who puts a comment in, and we insist on comments to give a rationale for each code that we would consider vulnerable, which is most codes. And that, as well as a comment, we would ask for the initials of the colleague that has put that comment in, so that if we need to go back and do some further training, we know who to do that training with, or if we need further information because we need to ask further questions, we know exactly who to go to get that information from. Okay, thank you. Next slide. Okay, so this is just an example of one of the daily reports that the Trust does. It gives us a 3-day sort of running average of attendance across all of our schools, which allows us to see where schools might have anomalies over the 3 days or in the category of school that they've been put in. So this allows for that deep dive, for that sort of interrogation of the data. And as a trust, we use Power BI and we download every code every night so that we always have the ability to easily scrutinise what registers look like. We do have the capacity to actually remote into the school's individual SIM systems as well, but actually using Power BI to bring together all that coding information is much more quicker and efficient, and it might well lead us then to go on to look at the actual individual SIM system. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are some of the key things in terms of getting accurate coding? The first thing I would say is try and minimise the number of people who have access to the full suite of codes. So, for example, a form tutor and a teacher, they only need the access to the present mark, to an N code because they don't know where that pupil is, and to an L code if that pupil arrives late. They don't need to be putting reasons in, and neither do teachers, for where that student is. And therefore, you can very using SIMs, you can lock down the right codes for the right people in the right responsibilities that they have. It's absolutely key to address any missing registers in real time. If you don't do it in real time, it creates a massive amount of workload downstream. So what we want to do is get to it quickly and get it resolved while the pupils are still in that lesson. So we give our teachers 10 minutes to do their register, and if it's not completed, then we will either ring them, go knock on the door. We'll find somewhere. Different schools do it in different ways. Staff on duty, for example, might well call into the classroom, but we will ask that teacher to do it. Invariably, it's the same old thing. It's the sorry, I have done my register, but I just forgot to save it. But it does happen. To be fair, I was a teacher for a long time, and I've been guilty of that myself on occasions. But what we're trying to do is to minimise and make that a rare occurrence rather than something that's happening all the time. We nominate one member of staff, usually the key attendance administrator or attendance officer, to check the coding every day. So do the comments, the coding tally, are they all in alignment with each other? And if they're not, to make those amendments, but also to remember to have a conversation with the people that did the code in the first place. Again, constantly looking to refine our processes. We also check for missing marks daily. We also check that we're still within that 5 working day deadline for unexplained absence. Okay, and finally, we would expect our SLT leads for attendance to be involved in making regular checks of the quality of that process of the coding. And I would also, as part of the central team, make some compliance checks as well, which just helps maintain that consistency and might highlight any things that we need to deal with. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what does that in terms of, that's not going to happen on its own. It just doesn't happen because we want it to happen. We need to ensure that there is really thorough training and high quality opportunities to learn what we need to do. So, for example, when new staff join the trust and they're in a key role in terms of coding registers, then they would receive training as part of their induction process. We try and make that training as sort of interactive as we can by looking at scenarios, Something like quizzes in Kahoot can help, because it can give you an indication of how much of that training has been absorbed by having a look at the question, the answer analysis breakdown in Kahoot. So there's different ways we can do that. But I think one of the key things that we do after training is about a week after, we then go look at the actual registers with that colleague, and we jointly scrutinise registers and see what's best practice, see what could be improved sort of moving forwards. We do accept there's no such thing as a perfect register over the course of the year. It's never going to happen. You know, there's always going to be minor mistakes and things we could improve on, but we do take a lot of time in trying to get as close as possible to minimising any potential inaccuracies. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a scenario that we might use in the training. Normally there's some straightforward stuff, so you can see this is a pupil with 97% attendance, so there's no real attendance issues. They're actually in line with the STAR target of 97% attendance. This pupil, Julia, was absent from Monday to Wednesday. It's quite straightforward. It's a sickness bug. It's been reported by mum to school, and therefore it would be an I code for those 3 days. We've no need for medical evidence in this particular case, because attendance is at a high level. And you know, medical evidence should only be requested when we're starting to get in a situation where we need to start to challenge parents around what's been reported in absence through illness. She was at a museum on the Thursday, so that would obviously be a V code for a visit. But this is the last bit's the important bit, because what we're trying to do here is to pick up on common misconceptions that people might have. And therefore, this pupil, Julia, was in school on Friday morning, but she had a medical appointment and left at 10 to 3 in the afternoon. And what we find is that they'll get the morning session right, they was present, but sometimes people will put an M code into the afternoon session. Of course, when the statutory session was taken, this child was in school and it should be a present mark. We may reflect the M code later on in lessons, but the session mark should be a present. And therefore that would be a common misconception that we would address in our training. And it works obviously for the benefit of the pupil, the parents, and for the benefit of the school. And yet it's entirely in line with what the guidance is telling us in terms of practice. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a little bit about what routines might look like. They do vary a little bit from school to school, because schools need to find what works for them. But we do have some sort of minimum expectations around what should happen. We would expect all our schools to have a dedicated attendance line. Most importantly, and this is key, is when the staff arrive though, when the attendance officer administrator arrives, they should turn that off and they should take the calls live, because it's much more effective in terms of being able to find out higher quality information and being able to perhaps challenge why that child isn't in school that particular day if you're having that immediate conversation with the parents. Obviously, if you have other responsibilities at some point, you may need to turn it off again, but whilst you can, it should be live and not just go to an answer phone. Any messages that have been recorded early in the day, process them really quickly, work out what the reason for absence is. If it's unclear, we would ring back and we would find out more information. If through those conversations we're finding out that there are clear barriers to attendance, an attendance officer or an attendance administrator might not be best placed to resolve that issue, and therefore we would expect them to pass on that information in a really timely fashion with urgency to the pastoral colleagues, or sometimes curriculum colleagues if there's a curriculum element to the reason why that child doesn't want to attend school that day. Prompt action, absolutely really key. We also recognise that even before COVID, mental health of young people seems to have been becoming more of an issue, particularly around anxiety and depression. And therefore, that's only been exacerbated by what's happened with the COVID pandemic. And we're in a more difficult position now than we were then. So it's really essential that those pupils that find the transition from home to school really difficult have a soft landing, have an agreed mechanism in which they will be sort of invited and brought into school. So that may, for example, by an early breakfast club, so they avoid the rush and they get to spend some time sort of getting used to the school day. Or it might be they come a little bit later and they might meet with a trusted member of staff. They might go through their timetable for the day so they feel more confident about what is going to happen. It can look different for different young people, but it's essential that we think about that soft landing where it is important and it does really matter. Next slide, please. Okay, in terms of our calls, we expect all the calls to be made in the first hour. That is possible in most of our schools and does happen. Where it's not possible, we send a safeguarding email out just to make sure that the parent is aware that the child isn't in school at that point. But one of the ways we achieve that is through adding capacity to making the calls by our heads of year being involved in making those calls. So instead of just the attendance officer making the calls, we've got perhaps 5 heads of year that are also contributing to that, maximising the number of calls that you can make in that first golden hour, and therefore you know that we can often achieve having a really good take on what our attendance situation is like very early in the school day. Obviously, punctuality is an important part of attendance. We need to deal with latecomers, but we need to deal with them in the right way. We would always offer a warm welcome to anybody who's arriving late, followed very quickly by a thorough examination of the reasons why they're late and trying to get the child to reflect on how they can avoid that in the future. If the child can't come up with their own solutions, obviously as adults we would offer some ideas and where necessary, if it was more persistent problem, we would also speak to parents about putting some strategies in place at home. If warranted, we do a same-day detention for punctuality, and we think that is critical because if we delay the detention for another day, if we've got children that are a little bit flaky around attendance, having and knowing that they've got a detention coming up might well end up being a reason for them not coming that day and make an excuse not to be there. So therefore, a same-day detention wipes the slate clean at the end of the day. We start again tomorrow, everything's forgiven, and we start from scratch. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of calls, we don't just make that single call. This is what I would sort of call compassionate and caring pestering of parents. You know, we quite often make several calls in a day, so we'll make that first initial call. We might call again if we've got capacity, try and get them in for the afternoon. If we can't get them in for the afternoon, we might call later, try and sow the seed for attendance the next day. It's that rigour and persistency which can really move things on. And yes, as you can see from the picture, which I've very carefully chosen, sometimes parents can get a little bit frustrated, sometimes they can get a little bit angry, but sometimes that's a really important sort of process and barrier to go through, because quite often when you're on the other side of that conversation, that's where more honesty comes in, and that's when you can really get to the heart of the problem. We always do this in the most polite and caring way. It's really important that the parents know we're doing it for all the right reasons, because we care about the young people in our care. We care about their child and want the best for them. And if we're going to get the best for them, we need them to have them in school as much as possible. If we've got safeguarding concerns, we would do a same-day visit, home visit. If we don't hear from a family for 3 days, we would also do a home visit. We would also schedule key home visits over a period of time. Sometimes we have a strategy where we might target a geographical area and do some really early knock-ups on a regular basis for 2 or 3 weeks, get parents and children into good habits about coming to school and coming to school on time. So, you know, lots of different strategies that might be in place. We also on a daily basis publish not just the data, but we also publish to key staff the pupils that are absent and the reason that that pupil is absent. And that's really important to us because it gives us some really important intelligence, especially in close-knit communities. We often find out information that can help us then go back and challenge parents. So, for example, if a child has been off 2 days, but they were seen out, playing out in between, on the night in between, then that would, and they're supposed to be off with illness, then that would give us a way into that challenge conversation with parents. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, looking at rigor, I think it was in the first webinar, and I think it was the Northern Education Trust that said we'd ask our staff to obsess about attendance. So we absolutely condone that message. It's really important to have somebody that is leading that obsession though. So I was really pleased to see that in the guidance moving forward for September, there's the recommendation of an SLT lead or a champion, somebody that will be at the forefront of reminding people about attendance all the time, celebrating improvement or challenging things when they're not quite correct in briefing, assembly, form period, lessons, wherever. It doesn't really matter. We need to keep that absolute message that attendance really matters 100% at front and centre of our everyday practice. Rewards are really important. We know that some of our pupils have intrinsic motivation. They don't really care that if they're going to get reward or not get reward. They come to school because they like the teachers, they like the lessons, they want to do well, they want to do well in exams, they've got future aspirations. But unfortunately, that isn't all our young people. Some of our young people need other motivations as well. So having some extrinsic rewards is key. Not just rewarding excellence, for example, 100% attendance across the whole year, but having an inclusive approach where we can reward improvement, or we can have a period for a reward that starts from scratch. So it's open to everybody again. How you've attended in the past isn't going to close off that opportunity to you. And lastly, we love friendly competition it's not always a friendly, is it going to be? We love friendly competition at Star, and we like to get people fully engaged in that. So personally, I put 3 attendance leagues out. One of them's a daily league between some of our sponsored academies. We have a weekly league for the primary Super League, and then we've got the Premiership League for some of our other schools that goes out weekly. And schools can see where they stand on the year-to-date attendance. They can see how they've done last week. They can see how they've improved from last week. So we're benchmarking constantly. And it's really, really important that can be replicated internally in a school, in year groups, form groups, houses, even key groups of individuals that might have a bespoke reward attached to it when we need to improve their attendance. Okay, next slide, please. We need to, in terms of routines, they're really, really important for everybody that we get those routines right, but we also need to act on risk analysis. So we need to be able to categorise our pupils so we can focus on the ones we're most concerned about, spot things early, intervene early, and we need to have our data sat alongside our barriers and interventions that have been identified. Next slide, please. So you can see this is what one of our risk registers would look like. This is a semi-automated risk register that comes from Sims, and the output is in Excel. And as you can see, what it would do for us is it would categorise at the top left. You can see all the pupils will be categorised depending on their percentage attendance. Importantly, as you can see here in that first column, first coloured column in the main table, we look at last year's attendance at the start of the year, so we've got some context. We don't just start from scratch. And then building half term on half term, we would record whether that attendance is improving, what we're doing about it, what's working, what's not working, and what we need to escalate. Next slide, please. So this is our manual version. Some schools, we've been trialling the semi-automated version over the course of the year. It's available to all our schools from September. But this is what the old manual version looked like. It's actually from one of Asia's schools. And you can see here that we had concerns at the start of the year, but you can see half term on half term, you can see that those pupils changing colour. There's been a response to the interventions that we put in place, and we're seeing improvement over time. And we would continue to monitor that and continue to work with those interventions until they got them into one of the categories that we'd really like to see. Okay, next slide, please. Some of our schools that have, 98% attendance, 97% attendance, they would immediately bring the parents in at any hint of an issue. And to be honest, that's best practice. But where that's not possible, because you're perhaps if you're at a national average currently of 88% attendance, you need to stage and have a graduated approach so that you can narrow the pyramid as you go through. So here's some examples of how you might do that. The ones at the bottom are where the time and effort is fairly minimal. The ones at the top, you're going to have a lot of time and effort and energy in gathering that paperwork. It ultimately goes from mentoring through to a work on report, work with parents, through informal meetings to formal meetings, and ultimately would end with a referral to the local authority for a legal intervention. However, all that said is we don't mention anything legal, and whilst the parents are working proactively with us, whilst they are on our side, they're doing everything they can. The legal would never get mentioned. It's all about support. It's all about wanting the best for our students. We only move on to the legal process when we have a lack of engagement from our parents. So it's not about whether the child is attending or not attending. It's all about whether the parent is fully engaged in trying to resolve those issues. Next slide, please. Okay, so just bring my section to a summary there. You know, getting outstanding attendance, maintaining outstanding attendance is not about a few people, i.e. the attendance team, doing one thing really well, having really good at phone calls, for example. It's about the whole school community and doing lots of things really well over time in a really organised and systematic way. Change doesn't happen overnight. It'll be all about marginal gains and incremental change, but celebrate those successes, constantly benchmark. Not all schools are the same. Some of the things that I've mentioned might not work for your school, they might not be appropriate for your school. But the one thing I'm absolutely certain of is rigorous routines, regularly repeated over time, are key to maintaining really, really good attendance. And lastly, we do need to be adaptive. We need to adapt to the data. We need to look at the local nuance as well. So, for example, some of our schools have Friday attendance. It's the same as every other day of the week. Other schools, Friday attendance, we see a dip week in, week out. And therefore, we need a Friday attendance strategy to address that. In other schools, we might have key groups of young people in the demographic that don't attend as well. So we need to reach out to that element of the community, in both in terms of comms and in our work with individual families. So there is a combination of those rigorous routines, but also of those bespoke interventions for the young people that need it. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass over now to Asia, one of our executive principals.
Thank you, Ian. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Asia Ravat, Executive Principal at Star. I'd like to share some day-to-day practices that we implement at our school, Eden Boys School, Birmingham. Eden Boys School, Birmingham opened in 2015. It secured best attendance in the country for the first 3 years in a row. So each week we publish the attendance data for the whole school. We publish it by year group and forms for the previous week in our weekly staff briefing notes. And this is shared with all our staff on Monday morning. So on Monday morning, we have a weekly briefing with all staff, teaching staff and support staff. At that briefing, we celebrate those year groups and forms that have achieved 100% attendance for the previous week. And you can see on that table that these are highlighted in yellow. Next slide, please. We also publish the list of pupils that are at risk of becoming persistent absentees in our weekly briefing notes. These are pupils that have got 93% attendance and below. These are also shared in our weekly briefing meeting on Monday morning. So learning coordinators, so form tutors, are aware of those pupils in their forms that are at risk of becoming PA or are PA pupils. Next slide, please. So our weekly staff briefing on Monday morning is followed by morning registration. The form time activity on Monday morning is for pupils to reflect on their previous weeks. The idea is that they reflect and set goals for the forthcoming week. Pupils note down, first they've got to note down their attendance, achievement and behaviour points. Following that, they will set personal learning and spiritual goals. Our school is a faith school, so they set themselves spiritual goal for the forthcoming week. They'll set themselves learning goals and personal goals. We ask learning coordinators to work with those pupils that have been highlighted as at risk of becoming PA or have got attendance below 93% and below to set attendance targets as their personal goals. So our learning coordinators will sit with those children that have been highlighted and will set realistic, achievable targets. Now, these targets are individual to that pupil. So they'll sit down during that morning registration, have a one-to-one discussion and set realistic, achievable targets for those pupils. Next slide, please. Every day, the pastoral manager sends a daily attendance update to the senior leadership team, and this update is sent to the entire team. He shares the overall attendance for the school as well as year group attendance for that day. So although we do have a team that manages the attendance, so we have a senior leader that is responsible for attendance, we have a pastoral manager who is a non-teaching member of staff, and we have heads of year for each of our year groups. However, each member of the senior team is also linked to a year group and supports the head of year in managing the attendance for that year group. So we're very clear at the school that attendance is everybody's responsibility. The leadership of attendance is distributed across the senior leadership team. So just to give you an example, so our assistant principal who is in charge of teaching and learning is linked to year 8. And his responsibility is to work with the head of year 8 to ensure that year 8 attendance is in line with the school target. So each of our senior leaders is also responsible for the attendance of a year group. Next slide, please. We also capture all our attendance data on one sheet. We have a weekly attendance monitoring sheet, and that sheet displays the weekly attendance for the whole school, for year groups, for pupil groupings, and it displays the attendance over a term, each week over a term. We also display the attendance of each of those pupil groups last year, this time last year. Now, it does look onerous, but it isn't. This is populated by the pastoral manager. It's populated using our management information system, SIMS, and this is shared with the senior leadership team weekly. And this is presented by the senior leader in charge of attendance. So attendance has a really high profile at the school. It's a standing agenda item at our weekly senior leadership team meetings. I also ask the Link SLT members to provide an update for their year group. So again, you know, the idea is that the leadership of attendance is distributed and that accountability is to the top. It lies with the senior leadership team as well as the team that manages attendance in the school. But by tracking the attendance weekly, we can almost sort of predict what our weekly attendance target needs to be for the following weeks if we are to achieve the attendance target we have set for the year. So what I mean by that is currently we are sitting at about 98.2. If we are to secure that for the rest of the year, we've got to keep hitting 98 point. I think actually we've got to hit sort of 99% attendance for the next 4.5 weeks if we are to achieve a cumulative of 98.2, because currently we're sitting at 98%. If we don't hit 99% for the next 4.5 weeks, we're going to drop. Our attendance will be at 98%. So our teams know that for the next 4.5 weeks, they're going to have to work really, really hard and ensure that all year groups hit 99% attendance if we're going to reach our target of 98.2 for this academic year. Next slide, please. We also have a weekly attendance risk register. And this is populated by every head of year for their year group, for every child in their year group, not just those children that are at risk of becoming PAs. It isn't actually that time consuming. It takes about 15 minutes. And this is to ensure that we're monitoring every child's attendance over the course of the academic year. So we're able to identify quickly those pupils whose attendance is starting to decline. So you'll notice that the child on the table right at the bottom started with really good attendance at the start of the year, 100% attendance in the first 3 weeks, but it declined significantly. So we've had to intervene, and we're starting to see an improvement in his attendance. You will also notice that sort of a third on that table, a third of the way down, you can see a child that started with really poor attendance. He's been highlighted as red, but you can see that gradually his attendance has started to improve across the year. Thank you. Next slide. So the next few slides are slides that we share with pupils in assembly each week. So we share the attendance of each year group, and we try and instill a sense of competition between the year groups. These are also displayed on digital screens across the school throughout the week. Next slide. Thank you. I think Ian mentioned that we have a Premier League, and we have a league table for schools across the trust, but we also have an attendance champion league table in school. We've tried to create a culture of competitiveness for the boys around attendance between year groups and forms within the year groups. The forms that secure first position at the end of each half term are rewarded. You'll notice on that slide, we also mention previous years, winners from previous years. So 8B was the best form in 2019 and 8D was the best attending form in 2020. Year 8 seems to have sort of best attendance. Next slide, please. And we always, as senior leaders, and we get teachers to always compare their attendance at this point with previous academic year, because we constantly want to improve our attendance year on year, and we want to try and keep our attendance on an upward trajectory, because I think we're very clear that outstanding attendance secure outstanding outcomes for our children and for keeping our children safe. Next slide, please. We also sort of publicly recognise the number of pupils that achieve 100% attendance each week. So we are a school of sort of just over 600, and you'll notice on that slide that in week 33, 581 of our pupils achieved 100% attendance. And we're hoping that by displaying this across the school, that it'll motivate the pupils to keep their attendance at 100%. We also send text to parents, so each week parents receive text if sort of a celebratory text to those pupils that have achieved 100% attendance. Next slide, please. And we constantly reward, every half term we are rewarding those forms that achieve 100% attendance for that half term. And you can see that, you know, we held a pizza party. We have badges for our pupils for every pupil in that form, the form that achieves 100% attendance. Pre-COVID, we used to ask the children what they wanted as a reward. And we've taken children ice skating, we've taken them to the cinema, we've taken them to amusement parks, etc. So we're constantly rewarding pupils with 100% attendance. And I think that's it from me. Thank you so much for listening.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Asia and Ian, and indeed Lisa. There are a fair few questions that we've had through that I'm hoping to get to. Just quickly to say, we've had some questions about definitions of codes, and I think it's probably worth reminding people of where they need to go to look in the guidance. So if you follow the link to the guidance, it's got the definitions of all of the different attendance codes. So you should have a look there. We've had questions about the meaning of code J and exactly when that can be used. So that's just quickly to cover off that. We've also had numerous questions about whether the slides can be shared. So just to reiterate, yes, the slides will be shared after this presentation with everybody who has signed up. So we'll be sending them out afterwards, and everyone will get a copy. Just on the department side, to cover off 1 or 2 points that I've picked up, there was a question about whether or not we're introducing a specific mental health and anxiety code to cover pupils that aren't attending in those circumstances. Just to say, we already set out in the guidance that code I can be used to record illness, and that's illness which is both physical and mental health related. So schools should be authorising absence for illness, and they should do so unless they have a genuine cause to doubt the veracity of that illness, be it physical or mental health related. So that ought to be authorised and it ought to be recorded as code I. I will move us on though to a few questions, if I can, for our colleagues at Star. And let me just get to some of the questions that most people are interested up here. So there's a question about if Star has a specific approach to supporting pupils with disabilities and or long-term illness, and the approach that you take as an individual school and as a trust. Asia, I wonder if you are able to say anything about that in the context of Eden. You're on mute again, sorry.
Yeah, we work very closely with our families where we have children with long-term illness. We support by providing, I mean, at Eden Boys School, we will provide regular work for the children. We have gone as far as where we have provided one-to-one support, where we have sort of either used staff from school to go to the child's home and teach them at home. Sometimes I've sourced external support where we don't have the capacity to do that, where I've used external tutors to support that child at home. So we will try and remove any barrier that the child might have to ensure that they're still receiving a good education. You know, we're very clear that that child should still achieve excellence and should fulfill their potential.
Ian, did you want to come in and add something to that response as well?
Yeah, so just going to add that obviously if it's a long-term medical issue, using an individual healthcare plan to sort of bring together all those strategies as in line with the dealing with pupils' medical problems government policy would be really, really important. But also where students, where health sort of would indicate that a student is not fit to be in mainstream school, the local authority does have the legal responsibility to pick up that educational provision. Therefore, if it's going to be in the long term, we would liaise with the local authority to try and see what sort of, whether hospital schools or some form of hospital tutoring or whatever it is can sort of kick in for that student. In most cases, it's not as much as we would like. So as Asia said, we might then supplement that with additional sort of support from school. But at least, you know, local authorities should be offering something in terms of working with those pupils who are not fit for mainstream.
Excellent, thank you both. There's a question here, and I'm assuming this is not uniform across the trust, but there's a question about which members of staff do home visits and how that kind of works with staff teaching responsibilities. Asia or Ian, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, Will. It varies across schools. It's got to be sort of in line with the school's capacity to offer that service. So in some cases, it would be done by heads of years if they have the time. The best person to do it is the person that knows the family the best. So we would try as much as we can to get head of years out. That's not possible in all of our schools because it can be quite time consuming and we need them on site. And therefore, it might be somebody within the attendance team with a homeschool liaison responsibility, or in some cases, it might be even an outside consultancy that's used, especially for those schools that need additional capacity.
Excellent, thank you. The general question here, which I would be interested in your kind of response to, which is about how you work with families across the trust to reduce the taking of term time holidays. Ian, is there a kind of trust-wide approach that you take to that issue?
Yeah, so we generally discourage families from taking any leave in term time. We have quite a lot of comms around that in terms of newsletters, messages to parents, etc. It still does happen. We're in the stage, I think, as travel opened up, then it's happened more frequently of late than it did when travel was more restricted. And I think because some families have not seen each other for quite some time and they've got relatives abroad, that's opened up quite a problematic area for us. We do apply exceptional circumstances, but it's very rare that we would authorise a leave of absence in term time. We think very carefully around what the families are talking to us and telling us around the circumstances. But in most cases, what we find is that the request is either too long or it's not appropriate, or the impact on the child's education will be too great. And we normally, under most circumstances, would relate to the parents. Very, very quickly, by the way, we have as part of one of our priority actions is as soon as we get a request, a member of SLT should ring that same day to refuse the request or find out more information. And then we follow that up with a formal letter explaining why we are refusing the leave of absence request.
Excellent, thank you very much. There's a question here which I don't think was covered in enormous amounts of detail, but I'm sure there'll be things that you'll want to say about it, which is about punctuality, and this, I mean, really ties into everything that you've been saying about promoting a culture of excellent attendance. But are there specific kind of strategies that you use to ensure better punctuality within your schools?
Yeah, so you saw our attendance risk register in the same way, just didn't have time to show it in terms of the presentation. We have a punctuality risk register which mirrors the attendance risk register. So pupils would be put into categories each half term depending on how many lates that they'd had. And we would expect interventions to be put alongside the data in the same way that we would for attendance. So we don't really treat it any differently. Those pupils that are repeatedly and persistently late, we would look to address that through a number of interventions, including working with the family to put an action plan in place in order to resolve that issue for that particular individual student. I don't know if Ashley wants to add anything to that.
Well, we have a minibus, and so I also have a business support officer that supports the pastoral team. So he's able to, with a member of the admin team, to do home visits, pick up pupils if they are. So what we do is we work with the family to identify what the issue is. Sometimes, I mean, some of our children come from sort of, because we opened in 2015, some of our sort of year 11 pupils come from across the city, and they're catching 2 or 3 buses. So we work with the families to identify what the barrier is. And on occasions, I have sort of sent a taxi to pick up the child or sent the minibus to pick the children up. So yeah, and because we have a member of staff that is non-teaching and supports the pastoral team, he's available to do that.
Lisa, did you want to add
Yes,
to that?
I also wanted to add another successful strategy that we've used. Often it's not unusual for a leader to actually ring home early morning to actually give a wake-up call to a pupil to make sure that they're setting off on time, and that tends to prove to be very successful for pupils who are regularly late. So giving them that prompt reminder on the morning to give them plenty of time to get into school.
Excellent, thank you very much. I realise we are running slightly over, but if Lisa, Asia and Ian are happy, there are one or two more questions that I'd quite like to put to you, if that's okay. There's one here about rewards. You talked a lot about incentivising and promoting excellent attendance and sharing that information and generating a sense of healthy competition between year groups. And there's a question again about balancing that against pupils who aren't necessarily able to attend full time, or perhaps have a long-term health condition which means that they can't attend. Do you want to say anything about how you adapt your kind of rewards processes for those pupils?
Yes, obviously, if for example, a long-term medical condition or a serious illness, we would simply look at them as an individual to reward them for maintaining the level of attendance that's been agreed, but be very compassionate around that target setting process. So they'd still have a target, but it'd be a target just for them. We would also take them out of the sort of form competition, etc., so that they didn't unnecessarily bring down the overall performance of the form. But all this needs to be done in a very, very careful way, explaining what's happening to the students, the family, etc., to the other pupils to some degree, within the bounds of confidentiality. You know, we're a family and we work like that, and young people understand that there are exceptional circumstances if you take the time to explain it properly.
Fantastic. There's one or two more very directly operational questions. There's one which is lots of people have been interested in, which is how many pupils are at Eden Boys School. And I'll just pair these up. There's another one about whether your attendance percentages have study leave for year 11 pupils stripped out of them, and whether you kind of make those changes to the headline percentages, or if that reflects the fact that the pupils are in fact still in school. Asia, should I come to you for those?
Yes, so our children aren't on study leave. So as soon as the exams started, we moved to a collapsed timetable. So our children receive masterclasses, so they're in every day. They receive masterclasses for the forthcoming exam. So I've delivered one today for chemistry because they've got a chemistry exam on Monday. That's their next exam. So our children are in every day. In terms of number of pupils, we have 125 in each cohort. So it's a relatively sort of medium-sized school. Our attendance has dipped slightly since we've opened. Our first few years we were at 98.3, 98.2. Last couple of years we've been sitting at 98.
Excellent, thank you very much. There are hundreds more questions that are streaming in, but I think we might have to call it to a conclusion relatively soon. There's a few more questions here about whether you would be happy to share any of the template resources that you've alluded to, which perhaps I can pick up with you all after this session, and we could circulate those if you're happy. There's one other thing that I would just like to briefly mention and reiterate. It hasn't actually come up in any significant way, which is just about Codex, which is obviously the department is no longer advising schools to use Codex to record COVID-related absences, but thought it's worth reiterating that point. I think, given it's 5:10 now, we'll call it there, but thanks again to Ian, to Asia and to Lisa for a really, really comprehensive and thorough look at the kind of processes that they have in place across the trust and within an individual school. It's been really, really useful, and I hope everyone who's dialed in has found it useful too.